See. All right, we're gonna get started. Just for announcements this week. Homework 3 is already due. This is pretty standard. Homework 4 is also going to be released tonight. No lab assignment this week. Instead, we're going to be kind of demoing Figma, which you may have heard of. It's the software that you're going to use to prototype your websites. Foreshadowing. We've also released a midterm project, and we'll kind of like walk through that. And it's on the Notion for you to look through. All the instructions, all the details are there, as well as like grading details and deadlines and such. But basically, you'll have a week to kind of draft a website. And then within that week, you have to check in with your TA. Or I guess it doesn't have to be your TA, just any TA, whichever office hour you can make. Check in with them. They'll give you a check, and that'll give you like 4 automatic points. So please don't forget to do that. And as always, 6 mandatory attendances for lecture. Yeah, we cannot pass you if you don't make 6. Yeah, that's it for announcements. Today we're doing CSS positioning and centering. And now David will take over.
Okay. And yeah, in terms of the midterm project, it's been released on the Notion. And you'll be creating a website from scratch, given pertaining to the given theme. The due dates are that you'll need to create a high fidelity mockup by Thursday, March 2nd, and get it checked off in office hours for 3 points. I don't know if it's 4 points.
Oh yeah, it's been adjusted to 3 points.
Okay, so it's been adjusted to 3 points. So yeah, if you don't get checked off, the maximum you can get is 19 out of 22. So yeah, don't start coding until you've gotten that check off. So now getting into content for today's lecture. Before we begin, we can take a look at like an HTML skeleton. So this skeleton is made up of a whole bunch of big boxes. So each of the like blue outlines is one box. So you can see that there's kind of like a big box around everything. There's smaller boxes that encompass like different sections. So you can see like from Berkeley Food Guide to coffee shops, there's one big box. From like restaurants to restaurants description, there's like another big box. Coffee shops to the description, there's another big box. And then each of the tiny boxes is each element. Is there any questions on like how the skeleton code looks? Cool. Okay. So now it's important to think of each of these divs as like containers in parent-child hierarchies. So for example, that big box is the parent of everything else inside. And then each of the children of that big box has its own children, and we can go down this hierarchy however long we want. So for example, like the big box was, well, the first big box is the body. The second box that encompasses everything is our div. Then our top half is our header. And in that we have an H1 tag, and we have a UL, an unordered list. So yeah, that's kind of how we have our structure set up. So now when we have our content, we'll want to position them relative to their parent container. So whenever we position, we're always positioning in terms of what the parent box looks like. So for example, this is how we'd kind of like put our skeleton code from here into this kind of model, resulting in this kind of shape. As you can see that like the restaurants and coffee shop sections from the skeleton code are moved to be side by side, and the unordered list from earlier is also moved side by side. So the big deal about divs and boxes is our positioning. So the key behind making a website look good is how we position things. When we're positioning things, we're disrupting how HTML will want us to put things, which is like our normal flow of elements. So instead of like just straight top down, we can change it to be kind of horizontal in some places, or yeah, just different in some places. So let's get into positioning. We have four main types of positioning. They are static, which is our default. This is what happens when you don't apply any sort of styling. It's just each box is placed on top of the next box. And then we have relative, which is positioning it according to the normal flow and then adjusting it based on some relative offset. And so that offset doesn't affect any surrounding elements. Our third one is absolute, which is pulling it out of the normal flow entirely and positioning it close to its closest positioned ancestor. And then we have our fixed elements, which are pulled out of the normal flow and positioned relative to the window / viewport. So for example, like this whole screen is a viewport and like our tabs stay at the top always. Like no matter what we're doing in this area, these elements at the top stay there for even if we scroll. Do we have any questions about the kinds of positioning? Cool. I'll give you guys a second. Okay. So kind of a demonstration of each of our positionings. We have default positioning, which is when we have no styling. And as you can see, it kind of just goes top down. We have just A, then B, then C. And they're positioned so that each one is right after the other. So there's no spacing in between either. So next we'll go into relative positioning. And so this is positioning with the normal flow and then applying an offset that doesn't affect the surrounding. So here we can see this example. The position is relative. So this is in our styling. We're actually using the same HTML as what's listed here, but now we are just applying the styling. So for our B class, we're applying position to be relative, and then we're doing top 20 pixels and left 30 pixels. And you might notice that the direction might be opposite of what you might think. So this is saying that the top is moving 20 pixels down and that the left is moving 30 pixels to the right. Is there any questions about how that works? Okay, cool. So kind of as a way of marking that, we can see that like if we use the left with a positive 20 pixels, it's going to move to the right 20 pixels. And when we use top 20 pixels, then it's going to go down 20 pixels. So for another example, we have left of 50 pixels and bottom of 20 pixels. So that means that we're moving the left edge right 50 pixels and we're moving the bottom edge up 20 pixels. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. And then again, here's like a little arrow diagram. It's moving to the right and it's moving up because we used left and bottom. So kind of think opposite of what you might think. Next, we have an absolute positioning, which is pulling it entirely out of the normal flow and then positioning it to the nearest relatively positioned ancestor. So what that means is that we have position absolute. We're still styling our B class, and it's kind of covered by this, but we have our B showing up in like the top right corner off the screen. So we set right to 0 and top to 0. So our top edge is going to 0 pixels and our right edge is also going to 0 pixels. Is there any questions about that? So it's like it's being positioned according to the outermost box, the like gray box around everything. And so it's being styled with a position absolutely. So why did that happen? Why did it break and go outside of our container? We don't have our container class positioned. Okay. So when we have content, we will position them relative to their containers. So you can see that like everything is kind of still in the main flow, but like relative to their absolute container or their parent container, sorry. And so we have our container positioned to relative. And so now we actually have it inside of our container, where our right edge is at 0, and our top edge is at 0 as well. Is there any questions? Okay, cool. So yeah, if we wanted to place things on top of each other too, absolute positioning can come in handy. So if we set our container to be relative, we have all 3 of them going into the same spot because they're all positioned absolutely. So that means that like they'll all kind of stack into that one spot on the window. Any questions on that? Okay. And then again, so they're all like at 0, 0 in terms of the parent div. So the parent div has all 3 of them, A, B, and C, all in the same position. So relatively positioned ancestors act as like the origin point for the absolute positioning. So in this example, our container, which is the outer box, is the relatively positioned element. And then everything inside is absolutely positioned. So it's being put where the origin of the relative position is. So do we have any ideas on how we could position the sign up form here? The book unique places to stay and things to do. Go ahead. Yeah, so we could use left a lot of pixels. Do we need to do anything else? Yeah. Yeah. If we also move the top, then we'll get our positioning. So our relatively positioned container is the whole screen essentially. And then we can use absolute positioning to put the sign up form there, particularly through using top to move stuff downwards and left to move stuff right. So next we have fixed positioning. Fixed positioning is saying that the element is pulled out of the normal flow. So that means that it's positioned relative to the window. Basically, the window is where your the size of the like window itself, the tabs. So if we have like fixed positioning, this blue bar is going to be our like fixed position. It's like pretty useful for nav bars. And it's set to left and top, which means that it's stuck at the left and top of our window, where our window is this box. So yeah, any questions on how fixed positioning works? Cool. So yeah, like even if we scroll, like the fixed positioning stays exactly where it is, regardless of how we scroll or move the page around. So can you guys point out what might be fixed positioning here? Yeah. This one? So this one is still in our normal flow since like we can stack things from like web design decal down to a 2-unit course. And then if we scroll, we still want this 2-unit course to like move along with the page. Any other ideas? Yeah. Yeah. So this like applications are now closed. This part would be our like fixed position because even if we try and scroll, we're going to want to have this stuck to the top of the page. And so that's for things that we want to have like persist. Even as someone like explores the page, we might want them to look at this one thing. So now in terms of centering, which is another very important part of positioning, we can like horizontally center block elements. So we have 5 potatoes on the screen, and we want to put all of them to be like horizontally centered into the middle of our window. So if we select all of our potatoes and we use margin right to be auto and margin left to be auto, then it'll auto fill in the margins on either side and give us a centered element. So yeah, margin right auto and margin left auto are the keywords there. And then we can also get around this by saying margin 0 auto to achieve the same effect. And then vertically centering a block element using absolute positioning. So we have one big potato here that has a certain width and a certain height. And we want to position it absolutely. And we want to move its top edge 50% down the page. So 50%, or sorry, 50% down its relative div. So that moves it down to so that the top edge is aligned with our middle axis. But what we want is to have the middle of our big potato to be in the middle axis. So how can we do that? We can use transform and then translate Y to move it up 50% of its own height. Any questions on how that works? Good thing to note here is that it's using negative 50% because it needs to translate upwards. And so upwards in our context here is going to be negative and downwards is going to be positive. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, there's no, I think like the way that CSS likes to select things is by its edge. So like the top edge versus the bottom edge, and there's no like middle edge. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. Okay. So we'll move on from here. So we also often want to center things. So like putting an element in the middle of the screen. So to do that, we just do the same thing that we did for putting it vertically centered, and then doing the same thing for horizontally centering it. So we move our left edge to the middle axis. So our left edge would actually be here, and our potato would be something like this. And then we translate it backwards to the left again by 50% of the width, and we get that the big potato is in the middle of the screen. Any questions on how that worked? Or how any of this is working? Cool. So then in terms of like miscellaneous stuff, we have Z indexing, which is such a complicated name for moving stuff on top of another thing. So if we wanted to have A on top of B instead of B on top of A, we could set the Z index to be greater for A than it is for B. So like for this example, we're using z index of 1 for A and z index of 0 for B. And then our screen displays the highest z index on top and then going down as we going down would layer it downwards. Any questions on that? Cool. That's all for positioning. Is there any questions on anything related to CSS positioning? Okay, then we'll move on to design.